Um, my name's Ann Harvey. I came with my then husband to San Diego in 1968, just in time for the student strike. And seeing people sit on the ground and talk about good ideas let me know that if enough people have good ideas and are willing to stand up for it, you can make things happen. You can speak truth to power. And so we wound up with Lumumba Zapata College for the third college. Want to ask questions?
Well, tell us about when you first moved into Carmel Valley.
Yeah.
What
Um,
what it was like.
we moved into a little house that was moved on in a neighborhood of auctioned off Navy officers' houses. And it was on a dirt road. It cost $15 a month, and there was nothing else yet here. But that neighborhood, when UCSD was being proposed, there were realtors in La Jolla who were blackballing other realtors who sold to Jewish people. And so the state sat down with them and said, if you want a major university here, you can't do this anymore. But the bad odor still lingered. And so my neighborhood was known as Jew Hill and then later Artist Hill because so many staff members from UCSD moved up there. But we were on a dirt road with no sewage, very little city water, wells that pumped rocks, and we loved it. My husband and I came there from Reed College in Portland, Oregon, which was very lush and green. And we came in the fall, and it looked like a desert. It was dusty and chalky, and all the plants looked weird. Um, but then finally it rained, and we started walking. And that's when we discovered Carmel Mountain. Um, at first, there were no trees. There was one struggling Torrey pine on Carmel Mountain. Um, there were a lot of bushes. Um, And when it rained, we suddenly realized they were flowering bushes. They were Indian paintbrush and ceanothus that looked like it had snowed everywhere, and monkey flower, and so on, and little bulbs that came out of nowhere. And that was nice. But then slowly, and there was wildlife. There were coyotes that were sleeping on the dirt roads. There were bobcats that just strolled across the road in front of you. There were jackrabbits as high as your waist, sitting with their long ears. There were deer with fawns later on. And one day my neighbor told me my dog had treated a mountain lion. She was an Australian cattle dog named Tough Cookie. And indeed she had. The rangers came later and looked at the paw prints and said it was a big male. And when you were on top of Carmel Mountain just strolling, you could see all the way to I-15 and all the way to the ocean to the west. It was an amazing place. There were stringed off areas with shells that looked very old. And we learned later that the indigenous people would get shellfish down at Penasquitos Lagoon. But there were so many mosquitoes, they'd go all the way to the top of the mesa where there was a breeze to break them apart and eat them. And then we started sitting down in the moonlight sometimes up on Carmel Mountain. And we discovered tarantula wasp with a paralyzed tarantula, dragging it toward its nest for its eggs to hatch and eat it. There were horned lizards that looked like little potato chips when they were babies. And later we learned about the soils themselves. There was something called ashy spike moss. One time we took some kids from High Tech High up to the mesa, and one of the kids had a big magnifying glass, and he leaned over to look at it, and he almost fell back across the road because it looked like a forest when he actually looked at it. And we also learned about the soils, that there were many of the bushes that were symbiotic, either with themselves or with other species. And just this last few weeks, we're learning about carbon transfer through roots, plants sharing carbon transfer, which meant that if someone is on a horse and decides not to step on the bush, he may have destroyed its connections and it's going to die anyway. We learned that later. But again, it was such a complicated place. There were raptors. The gnatcatcher lived there and sounded like a cat mewing. And we got so attached to the land that it was getting hard to realize we were going to have to move on. The property across the road was owned by the Teamsters Union Pension Fund. and North City West came into being in 1975. This is the original plan for North City West, complete with bookmarks. But that's what it looked like. And the valley where we lived was supposed to host something called Skyline Drive, which was 4 lanes wide. And my house was slated to be a school and a park. And a consultant told us that none of the houses would be left. So, and then North City West began, and there wasn't a ribbon cutting ceremony at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon. So North City West was planned and approved in 1975 for about 40,000 acres. Must have been 4,000 acres. No, maybe it was 40. Anyway, for 14,000 houses, a major shopping center, parks, schools, neighborhood shopping centers within half a mile of every house. And I-5 was supposed to come to be to serve it. Pardee had developed Mira Mesa, and the city was still smarting from that. They built a whole bunch of houses in the middle of nowhere, but they didn't have any good road connections. There wasn't a sewer line, there weren't water lines, there weren't school sites, and there weren't parks. Mira Mesa was still trying to assess itself for a baseball field about 5 years ago. And the city taxpayers had to pick up the costs for all of those things. So North City West had to be very carefully planned so that didn't happen again. And at that point, they had developed a planning board out of local citizens for North City West. And they divided into phases 1 through 9 and 10. And all the infrastructure had to be in place in time for each of those phases, so nobody got left marooned. And we were neighborhood 8. So north of 56 was going to come first, and we were going to come later. I met a Pardee consultant. Pardee hired a new consultant, a guy who had been the planning director of the city in 1962. And they accused him of being a communist. But the picture of him showed him sitting in a bunch of sagebrush. I thought, that's the guy I need to talk to. And that's the one I told that we would give up 4 out of 5 of our houses. And he was very excited to take that information to Pardee. So after that, Pardee really wanted to listen. And then they graded neighborhood 10 ahead of time. And that had been mostly farmland, but again, it was a blitzkrieg. They arrived late in the afternoon. The bulldozers were all around it, and they worked toward the center. And there were deer running into the road. And there had been a pair of kites nesting in a old eucalyptus grove, and the next morning they were sitting on their stump. And there were some hawks picking up the half-dead snakes and rabbits and everything else. So it was just getting awfully clear what was going to happen to Carmel Mountain at that point. So I thought, what do you do? What do you do? Somebody gave me a list of environmental organizations, about 7 organizations long. They didn't even all have phone numbers. Remember, there's no internet, there's no email. And so I started dialing, and the first person who answered on the third one was Michael Beck. And he said, "Are you talking about neighborhood 8? And I said, "Yes." Somebody else knows about this. So Michael got on board.
What organization was Michael with?
I don't know.
Endangered Habitats
League, I
League.
guess. I don't know whether it was even formed yet. But anyway, it
Close
was
enough.
Michael. And what happened next? The first hearing happened for neighborhood 8. By then it was neighborhood 8A. They divided into A, B, and C. And Pardee owned B and C. And they scheduled the hearing for Halloween night, Halloween Eve. So a lot of people wanted to go home and help their kids with trick or treat. And it was the last item on the agenda. They thought they were just going to sneak this right through. And there were 400 people there. The Sierra Club kicked in and got a lot of those people there. and there was a guy outside the council room, a really tall guy. I thought he might be on stilts, in a giant gnatcatcher suit. And he was taking names and phone numbers, and it was just a rout. The party vice president, said, "This isn't Christmas, and you can't just have that land. If you want it, you're going to have to buy it," right? And so on and so forth. So then we did an assessment district. The cities helped us do a huge assessment district that included Delmar Heights and so on and so forth. And it would cost each household $50 a year to buy what party said would be the cost of that land, which was millions and millions of dollars. And it looked like it was going well. One of my neighbors actually paid for a poll ahead of time, and it looked like it could actually happen. But Pardee cheated. They revised their map quickly and left a little open space, right? And they sent out a glossy, colorful brochure that folded out that showed you what you could have for free. And the assessment district failed, but not by much. We had Mayor Golding at the time, and we got to testify when it was the hearing to say it had failed. How many of my neighbors had thought that was worth saving and were willing to pay for it. Mayor Golding was always pretty much on our side. Later we learned that she had tried to save a canyon when she was a young woman and failed. And she was kind of sympathetic. So we couldn't buy it. What happened next? Several things happened that put Pardee really on the ropes. Plans started coming in for the San Diego River Valley from the racetrack to the east that would have turned it into Mission Valley. And everybody, including our planning board, was violently opposed to that. And it went to the ballot, citywide ballot, as Propositions F and G. We had other names for those. And they failed miserably. But we were lining the roads with kids with signs and so on and so forth. And in the meantime, we had good
And how
newspaper
about
reporters.
stepping back a second,
Yeah.
and explain when the planning board formed and when you were first elected to it?
It first formed before we went to St. Louis, and looked like a bunch of developers, and we weren't sure if we were coming back. But when we did come back, John Dean, who was my next door neighbor, told me about the planning board and said, "How would you like to represent this neighborhood?" Yeah, and they called me Jane Dean, right? Because I was taking his place, not as chair, but as the representative of that neighborhood.
How long were you on the planning board?
Over 25 years. Yeah. In all of this, trying to help our fellow citizens understand about Carmel Mountain, nobody really knew where it was, and there was only one way to get there, and that was on Arroyo Sorrento Road, or Old Carmel Valley Road. But they started building something at the corner of El Camino Real and Old Carmel Valley Road. And I made a sign out of plywood that said Carmel Mountain this way with a big arrow, and wired it to the fence. And after that, people started realizing where it was. And we started talking about it becoming a park. We didn't know the term open space park yet, but a park. And we made flyers, and we realized the best place to catch people with the flyer was on the freeway ramp in the morning. And so we'd line up on the freeway ramp and hand them the flyers. And it seems like kind of a scary thing. One guy was almost bouncing across car hoods. He was so crazy to get these flyers into people's hands. And one time we didn't go, and people said, "Where were you? Where were you?" And they'd roll down their windows for us to hand in flyers at the latest on Carmel Mountain. And then at one of the hearings, a ranger in uniform from Torrey Pines State Reserve came, and he said that if Carmel Mountain was developed, that Torrey Pines State Reserve would become an empty shell, that there might still be some trees standing, but the wildlife would be all gone. Pete Wilson had earlier aced Torrey Pines Reserve's involvement. They said they would manage a reserve there if there was one. And Pete Wilson went to Sacramento and had them rescind that, insisted they rescind that they would manage it. but they nevertheless remained willing to manage it in another administration. So that helped. I'm trying to think what else happened before we actually came to the big showdown. The City Planning Commission met on Carmel Mountain because it was so controversial. They said, we want to see what this is. And they actually had one of their official meetings, not just a stroll across it. They brought tables and microphones and had the recording secretary and, everything that they normally do, and walked all around. And one of my neighbors, who's an organic farmer, hosted a lunch, and they were just looking shell-shocked. They kind of had no idea what was up there. And after that, they realized it was real in their minds. So after the big proposition loss and general citywide votes against development, as more and more people came, the open space got littler and littler, and people got attached to it and realized it was going to go. So sentiment in the city was very anti-development at that point. They finally came up with a proposition. And there were interesting people involved at that point. Craig Adams for the Sierra Club and other environmental organizations were talking. And what they proposed was they owned land, which is north of 56 for the most part, reaches to the San Dieguito River Valley, east of Carmel Valley. And they wanted to develop it. But they knew this was all in the future urbanizing area, which required the ballot of the whole city. And they realized that they were not going to get it at that point. So what we eventually did was traded Pardee getting the hell off of Carmel Mountain for potential endorsement of their new development, which was going to be called Pacific Highlands Ranch. Only Pacific Highlands Ranch had to pass muster with every one of the environmental groups in order for us to be able to endorse. So then there were 18 months of meetings downtown with city staff, all the property owners, and there were 17 little ones on Carmel Mountain as well. It'd been a cereal box top thing of some kind. 1 acre in sunny Southern California, and there were all these little bitty acre holdings, and somebody had to buy them out too. With a city staffer in charge who didn't like the whole operation. He was awful. I heard the developers were drawing lots to see who had to hire him out of the city, which is clearly what he was bucking for, just to get him out of the way, because he was so obstructive and unproductive. But Pacific Highlands Ranch had Sierra Club brought in someone from outside, Pardee brought in a consultant from outside, and they assigned us a new vice president.
And I was on that
Beth
committee.
Fisher, yeah.
Yeah.
So what does Pacific Highlands Ranch have to be in order for all those groups to endorse the development? It had to have bamboo floors, solar panels, the state of the art at the time. It sounds kind of weird now. Grassy swales instead of underground storm drains. Had to preserve this and that. And then we went on field trips, hiking over all of Pacific Highlands Ranch. And project design consultants had one really good engineer. And we would say, we think you ought to preserve from that bush over there over to the edge of the creek over there because X and Y and Z is growing there. And we didn't have GPS yet, but he would take out a map, topographical map, and point out where that was. And when we came back later, indeed, there'd be a stake there. No, you can't go beyond this point. His name was John Erdenson, and I think he won the day.
Was that latitude 33?
That's latitude 33.
Yeah.
Some of its engineers were nasty, but John, we believed John. He was honest. That helped a lot. But one day we were hiking in the rainy season, and a big Pardee vice president who looked like Humpty Dumpty was along with us. And we were going up a steep slope, and it was muddy. We all had our mud boots on. And we realized he couldn't move. He was stuck in the mud. Slowly, he went over backwards in the mud. Many field trips, bush by bush, rock by rock.
Was that Chuck?
Elevation. Yeah, Chuck Coram.
Chuck Coram.
There's a street named after him in Carmel Valley. and we finally achieved what we liked. And it was called the Mr. Potato Head Plan because it had alternatives for each of the other property owners, some of whom wanted to do a good job and some of whom wanted to nuke their adjacent property. And we told the decision makers they could decide which combination they wanted to go on the ballot, and they picked a good combination, hoping to goodness that it would pass. And then I and Mike and Greg and
Yeah.
other people had to go and hammer out the language in the ballot measure so
Yeah.
it would appeal. I don't even remember all the details of that, but Pardee wanted what's called a development agreement, which means you can't take it away from them afterwards. That was hard line. And then we all got listed as endorsers. You know, the ballot booklet that says who's in favor of this. So we were all listed. And it passed.
I think it was 54% to 46%.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Passed handily. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then Carmel Mountain became a preserve.